Thank you very much, Francis. I must admit, when we scheduled or thought of this evening's lecture a week after the election, I was worried perhaps that interest may have peaked. And I'm very pleased to see a sea of expectant faces filling up the Curtis Auditorium, which reflects the fact, of course, this has been one of the most remarkable elections. One always says that, but this has certainly been a remarkable election. An election also, I wasn't sure when we planned it whether we'd know the outcome, even now. And we do, and we'll find out what happened, because I think your attendance here also attests to it's rare to have an academic who has, I think the term is a teledon, who has fame beyond the lecture theatre, and John Curtis has managed that. He's also had the ability of, of course, the election evening, with his exit poll, of causing despair and delight and incomprehension all over the country, with an exit poll which proves to be absolutely right. And I think he was referred to at one point by David Dimbleby as King of Polls. He fulfilling something of the role of, it's almost a constitutional convention to refer to David Butler as the doyen of psephologists. And David Butler was very pleasingly our speaker's doctoral supervisor at Nuffield College, Oxford. But whereas David Butler would be sitting on the left hand of David Dimbleby, so to speak, offering advice and observations, election night you may have noticed that John Curtis was high up in the gods, peering down from some scaffolding, causing what we now know to be serious indigestion for Paddy Ashdown and Alistair Campbell, as they've consumed items of headwear and Highland dress, respectively. We've decided to bring, I think one television reviewer referred to our speaker as looking like a jilted Juliet up in the sky. We've taken him down and are placing him centre stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John Curtis.
Thank you very much for that far too generous introduction, but I wanted us to report the data, but there we go. I'm going to start off with something desperately simple, which is just to remind you what the election result was, because sometimes these things are quite difficult to get your hands on. And then I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about. This was what happened on the night and how it compared with 2010. There are a number of obvious important elements to what happened. The first, arguably, is that UKIP displaced the Liberal Democrats as the third largest party in terms of votes. That undoubtedly means it's therefore justified what I was saying a couple of years ago, which is this is the most substantial, independent, wholly fourth party challenge in English politics. Though I must admit the events of today have reminded me to some degree of when William, I think it was doing the Liberal SDP alliance, and it was literally kind of late December 82, early January 83, when William Rogers revealed that they were having a row with the Liberals about who should have which seats, at which point the SDP Liberal Alliance balloon began to deflate. And it may well be that the UKIP balloon is now about to deflate, though of course they do have the small matter of a referendum to fight in a couple of years' time. Second obvious, completely record-breaking phenomenon is the success of the SNP in displacing the Liberal Democrats as the third party in terms of seats. The 56 of the 59 seats that the SNP got in Scotland is the highest share of seats won by any party north of the border since and including 1832. The previous record was 90% for the party standing for the national government in 1931. It's also notable that the Greens actually did quite well in terms of votes. They'd only got about 1% of the vote before. In other words, much of the surge of insurgent parties did actually reveal itself in the ballot box. Even in the case of UKIP, it didn't necessarily translate in terms of seats. What, however, you will also notice is that, these guys are a disaster. So we have to explain why this went up, which we'll come back to. We have to explain why this came down, which we will also come back to. Despite the fact the opinion polls were telling us it was all terribly close and exciting and interesting, by historical standards, that's still a pretty low turnout. But one of the things that this election confirmed, arguably we already knew it, is that the truth is that British politics doesn't exist anymore. Northern Ireland, of course, has long since the 1970s has had a separate party system from that of the rest of the United Kingdom. It's now also perfectly clear that Scotland does as well. So we really have to take the election into two halves. First of all, England and Wales. Here you can see how strong the dominance of the Conservatives actually was in England and Wales, around 9 percentage points. But also notice, for all the kind of crying over spilt milk about what happened, actually the Labour Party did make a net gain of seats in England, as did the Conservatives. But of course this is a crucial part of the story that we will come back to. In England and Wales, the turnout didn't excite a great deal of interest. North of the border, completely different. Completely different story. Notice number one. Crucial legacy number one of the referendum was that turnout in Scotland did return to something like the kinds of levels that we would have expected in the past. It got past the 70% mark. There is no doubt that the referendum in Scotland has energised people and created an interest in politics that people had never really seen before. This wasn't quite a record. The Tories managed to get 50.1% of the vote in Scotland in 1955. The Tories just missed the SNP just missed beating that record. But this is just a complete transformation, at least of Westminster level politics in Scotland. The Liberal Democrats suffered again. The Tories also, unbelievably, managed yet again to record a record low north of the border. The Conservative Party tried to send a tweet round saying we got 20,000 more votes than last time, and I got rung up by the Scottish Daily Mail saying how did they manage to do that? I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, it's just simply the turnout's gone up. Actually, these guys, the gap. So again, it's not just the SNP. The gap between Tory support north and south of the border, which already was at a record high in 2010, has again opened up to yet another record high. So we do have a government which, frankly, doesn't have much of a mandate north of the border. Lord knows what they would have done if David Mundell had not survived in Dumfriesshire. This is just completely dominant. And in many respects, we're now looking at something that looks very, very similar to the elections in what's now the Republic of Ireland before 1922. We've essentially got a bunch of Parnellites, arguably, now representing Scotland at Westminster. The consequences, well, I'll say a bit more about later on, whatever. And of course, the Labour Party, however, so when we start thinking about, as I'll come back to this, why did Labour lose, any analysis that doesn't take into account this, because this is where Labour really did lose. This is where Labour got hammered. So if we're going to try to explain how Labour recovers, it needs to be something that deals with this. Okay, what questions do I want to ask off the back of this? Well, number one is, I'm going to at least say a little bit about why the Conservatives won, though the truth is, even for a telly-don, a week isn't really long enough to sort out what the answer is. One of the things I do, however, and I can show you a little bit of, is the thing that you get most immediately in the wake of an election are the election results themselves. And one of the things I and my colleagues were doing on election night and have done more of since is literally analysing the election results and what clues do they give you. But clearly then what emerges out of the election are arguably three debates about how Britain is governed. In a sense, I want to focus on the implications of the election and the lessons of the election for each of those three debates. Debate number one obviously is about the electoral system. I must admit I've not quite done the calculation, but certainly a number of people are arguing that it is the most disproportional election outcome yet, and that sounds right if you think about it. And certainly the way in which the SNP comes third in terms of seats, but is fifth in terms of votes. The UKIP come third in terms of seats, but they're equal fifth in terms of seats. There are clearly arguments to be raised here. There are, however, also difficulties both about the Conservative and the Labour position as far as the electoral system is concerned, which I want to share with you. So number one is, where does this take us so far as the debate about the first past the post is concerned? The second, obviously, is the debate about how Scotland should be governed. We have had a party that is formally committed to independence, virtually completely dominate Scottish representation, and managed to get 50% of the vote north of the border. And clearly, we already knew that the new government was having to deal with what we're going to do in the way of more devolution in the wake of the Smith Commission following the referendum. That clearly is now even more pressing. And of course, last but by no means least, just in case you were feeling jealous about having and not having a referendum in last September, you can all now have your own referendum. It's going to be about Europe and what might we want to say about the future of the UK's relationship with the European Union. Okay, now there is one very, very simple answer to the question as to why the Conservatives won. In itself, it's a facile answer, but if we don't take it on board, we kind of miss an important part of the story. And the truth is, never have so many coalition partner politicians laid down their lives in order to ensure that their other senior coalition partners could secure a majority and tell them to buzz off. So far as the interchange of votes with Labour is concerned, basically it was zero. All right? The Conservatives were not making gains from Labour. They made 27 gains from Liberal Democrats, and they lost one to UKIP. We always knew that if the Tories could be as far ahead as they were in 2010, which they were, it's another 7-point Tory lead. All right? 7-point Tory lead in 2010 was not enough to deliver an overall majority. Why was it this time? Well, not because the Tories were able to take more seats off Labour, they weren't. It's because they were able to get seats off the Liberal Democrats. And we always knew that if the Liberal Democrat vote tanked, which it did, a 7-point Tory lead could be enough just about to get an overall majority, which is exactly what happened. And so the truth is that if the Democrats had not suffered in the way that they had done in the fallout from the coalition, it is unlikely David Cameron would have got his majority. So one very simple answer to the question is actually, well, it's because the Liberal Democrats were destroyed by the electorate. There's a second quite important mechanical reason. It was talked about quite a lot during the election campaign, and it was delivered. One of the things that we've learnt in recent years is that if, say for example, a Conservative defeats the incumbent Labour MP in a constituency, and then stands 5 years later, and the incumbent Labour MP, meanwhile, has found some other political consultancy to work for and is a rather more lucrative job, that in those circumstances, the new incumbent MP defending his or her seat for the first time tends to do rather better than their party does nationwide. Why? Because actually voters these days are somewhat more inclined to vote on the basis of what they think of their local MP and not simply on the basis of how they think of the party. So if a MP for a marginal seat is assiduous in fostering their constituency's interests, they're voluble about them, and they're reckoned to be pretty good at their surgeries, they can develop a personal vote. It's not enormous, it's 1 or 2%, but if you're defending a marginal seat, that can be crucial. And this is exactly what we saw going on this time. Across England and Wales, we have to do England, Wales and Scotland separately, across England and Wales, across the country as a whole, there's a 1% swing from Tory to Labour. Right? So there's a very small swing from Tory to Labour. But in the key marginals, now these are actually the constituencies, these are all the constituencies which would have been vulnerable, should have been lost on a 1% swing. I've forgotten how many, there's about 19 of them. So these really are the most marginal Tory seats, majorities of less than 2%. And in these, there's actually on average a swing to the Tories. And I think only 2 of them actually went. There were some others that went, and there was other surprising results, not least Ed Balls. But in the constituencies that the Tories were potentially vulnerable in, and actually it goes way beyond this particular narrow group, there's a swing to the Tories. The personal vote made a difference. The Tories were always anticipating that this is not what might happen, and it duly happened. But still, that still leaves us the question of, well, hang on, but why did the Tories get to 37, 38% in the first place, and therefore could profit from the Democrats' difficulties? and were doing well enough that actually they therefore could generate a swing in the most marginal seats? Well, some of it is fairly obvious, but if you look at the characteristics of constituencies in terms of their economic well-being and how well the Tories did relative to Labour, a fairly clear story begins to emerge. Let me first of all take you through. This is in terms of income. So here we're taking government data on the average level of income in a constituency, so household income. In those constituencies with the lowest level, I'm roughly dividing constituencies into 4 equal groups. In the constituencies with the lowest level of income, there is on average just around a 2.5% swing to Labour. And then as soon as you begin to get places which are kind of relatively affluent, the swing to Labour is weaker. The relationship's even clearer when you look at the level of unemployment in an area. In those constituencies where most people are unemployed, there's a 3.5% swing to Labour. And then as you go down here, there isn't much of a swing, and there's actually a small swing to the Tories on average in that part of Britain that is relatively well off. Now, this is quite an inferential leap, but almost undoubtedly, those parts of Britain, England and Wales, which had probably felt some sense that there really was an economic recovery, that perhaps they did not necessarily wish to lose, and certainly did not necessarily need for an alternative government in order to preside over, were inclined to swing to the Tories and return to the Tories. In contrast, those parts of Britain where that experience perhaps was rather rarer were more inclined to swing towards the Labour Party. So almost undoubtedly the perceptions on the economy mattered. And the truth is, one of the major strategic failures of the Labour Party in opposition was never ever to have persuaded people that actually they had an idea to run the economy. I mean, in the wake of following their defeat in 2010, the Labour Party faced a pretty fundamental problem, which was they had had the misfortune to preside over a financial crash and a ballooning of the UK's fiscal debt. Now, we can reasonably argue that not a great deal of that was to do with them or their fault, although banking regulation arguably was a little bit lax. But that having happened, it was then crucial as an opposition that you have to persuade people to forget what's happened. Or at least you have to persuade people that you've moved on, you've got an idea how to cope with the new situation, and you come up with a critique of the existing government that persuades people, well, the existing government's not doing terribly well, and hey, they missed a lot of targets, and we know how to do it better. Labour never ever succeeded in that task. Back in 2011, only 1 in 5 people trusted Ed Balls and Ed Miliband to run the economy. And in the last reading that Comrades did here, back in the summer of last year, still only 1 in 5 people trusted Labour to run the economy. So the truth is that certainly you can see why, therefore, those parts of Britain, England and Wales, that may indeed be experiencing a degree of economic well-being, were going to be unlikely to return to an opposition that had never really succeeded in convincing many voters that they knew how to run the country. So I think almost undoubtedly we will discover that that is an important part of the story. Okay, let me now move on to some of the implications. Where does the electoral system leave us in terms of how it's likely to treat the various parties? And I'm going to start with Conservative and Labour. And for anybody who is in the room, who's a Labour supporter and who is of a nervous disposition, I now say, hang on. This is something, kind of very standard psephological trick. So what I'm doing here, I'm saying, okay, let's work out what lead the Labour Party would need to achieve over the Conservatives, they would need in order to achieve various objectives if we take the 2015 result and just simply assume that the vote for the SNP, the Lib Dems, UKIP, Greens, everybody else just stays where it is, and there's just simply a swing from Conservative to Labour. All right? Now the first one's quite easy. This is a 0.4% swing from Conservative to Labour. We assume it happens in every constituency. If that happens in every constituency, then at that point the Tories' majority is just about to go. So in other words, on the current boundaries, the Tories need a 5.8 lead in order to hang on to power, or to hang on to an overall majority. Then you begin to see the rub. What happens if Tory and Labour are even Stevens? Tories still win by 50 seats or so. What does Labour Party need to get to in order simply to be equal with the Tories? Nearly 4 points ahead. What does Labour need in order to get an overall majority? 12.5% swing, 12.5 point leads over the Tories. Because Labour has lost so much ground north of the border, what it has to achieve south of the border in order to counteract that is, I would suggest to you, towards the ends of the improbable. And that, therefore, as a result, whichever of the four Labour aspirants to leadership, if they're trying to work out, what they need to do in order to get the Labour Party back to power, any strategy that does not take on board what's happened north of the border is frankly not going to work. But there's another crucial thing behind this. Notice the size of the gap. Anything between a 12.5 point Labour lead and a 5.8 Tory lead takes us back into the world of a hung parliament. The Tories, everybody at the moment is going, oh gosh, the Tories won, my God, they really did well, they're fantastic, right? They've got a majority of 12, which by the standards of first past the post elections is a small majority. On average, since 1979, governments have had majorities of around 100. Governing with a majority of 12 with rebellious backbenchers will not be easy. We're already seeing the Human Rights Act beginning to cause a row inside the Conservative Party, and people saying, well, will they be able to get abolition through or not? It's already, although we haven't ended up with a hung parliament, we only just missed one, and it may still be a hung parliament by before 2020 if the Tories start losing seats through defections and by-elections, etc. But this range is bigger than it's ever been. Because you've got 50 odd seats that the SNP are more or less guaranteed to win under my assumptions. So we can't therefore presume that we're back to normal, we're back to assuming that we're going to get overall majorities. There's another way of showing this point. This is a calculation I now do after every election. There's a really, really long-term story behind the increasing difficulty of first past the post to produce an overall majority for any party, and that is that we've got far fewer constituencies these days which are actually marginal between Tory and Labour. Now, I won't worry about the technical definition behind this, just assume that I've measured it in the same way across each election. Well, actually notice that in the wake of this election there are now even fewer marginal seats than there have ever been before. Why? Well, in part because yet again, and you might have guessed this from an earlier slide I showed you, those places where Labour was already strong have swung more strongly to Labour than are those places where the Tories were strong. In other words, yet again, and this has kept on happening at most elections, with the exceptions of one or two under Blair, we've moved yet further apart politically. So Scotland's just gone off on its own, but even England and Wales are now pulling yet further apart politically. There's a Tory England and Wales, there is a Labour England and Wales, and these two are become yet more divergent. And the more that happens, the more that the country pulls apart into two different political directions, inevitably the fewer places there are where actually Conservative and Labour are marginal, are competitive with each other. So therefore, certainly, that's one of the reasons why first past the post is struggling and may well still continue to struggle to produce hung parliaments. The second thing to note, of course, is, first past the post is meant to stop third parties winning seats. Now, despite the fact that the Liberals tanked and went down to 8 seats, we still have yet again another election where over 80 MPs represent parties other than Conservative and Labour. You know, you could put them all in a taxi back in the 50s and 60s, you still can't. And of course, if the SNP even retain a degree of their strength, and therefore some of their representation, and if the Liberal Democrats begin to recover from where they are, and they've now got 5 years to do it in, pretty good bet that number's not going to come down very easily. And of course, the more third-party MPs you have, the more difficult it is for the electoral system to produce an overall majority. So the truth is that although, again, we've got an overall majority, we can't assume we're going back to the status quo. Now, that said, some of you may be saying, well, hang on, there's another part of the story. Why is it that Labour now apparently have to do better than the Tories in order to win an election, when actually, after 2010, the opposite was the case? Well, the answer is basically contained in the bottom line of this, but let me walk you through it. It still remains the case, right, because the boundary review didn't take place. We still ended up in a situation where the average constituency won by the Labour Party had about 4,000 fewer registered voters in it. The gap didn't widen between 2000 and 2015. The population movement out of the cities is slowed, and as a result, we're not getting the gap widening. The boundary review should now take place in this Parliament, and that will largely eliminate that difference. What the boundary review cannot get rid of, and will still be likely to continue in place, is the fact that fewer people turn out in Labour areas. As a result, fewer people vote Labour, but it makes no difference. Labour still wins the constituency. But here again is the reason, this is why that swing to the Tories in the seats they were defending was so important and has such an impact. Of those 75 really, really marginal seats, 45 of them are on the Tory side of the fence, only 30 on the Labour fence. The Tories win more constituencies by small majorities. And under first past the post, that gives you an advantage. But then here's the other thing, and this is a fundamental transformation of party competition in the UK. Until now, the Conservatives always ended up winning more votes in constituencies that other people won. Because most of the places where the Democrats tend to win seats tend to be places where the Conservatives do relatively well, and Labour didn't. But of course, now all of those places have gone to be replaced by all these places where the Labour Party has just lost a seat to the SNP. So the Labour Party now is losing a lot of votes, not gaining anything, in constituencies won by third parties, i.e. by the SNP. And so it's these last two things which has turned a system which once looked as though it was going to be an advantage to Labour to the Tories' advantage, and there's a boundary review to come. It's going to be tough for Labour next time around. Why did Liberal Democrats lose as many seats as they did? Why did Paddy? Well, I mean, you know, they spent the whole of the last Parliament. You know, they clutched a comfort blanket to themselves, and they said, "It's okay, but we're doing well in the constituencies which we're trying to defend." And some of us kept going after every local elections, and we kind of looked at the evidence and said, "Oh, guys, well, maybe a little bit, but not very much." And then they said, "Oh, we won Eastleigh," and some of us pointed out, "You know what? Actually, Eastleigh is the third worst Liberal performance in the whole of post-war British politics if you measure it in terms of declining vote share. You only hung on to Eastleigh because UKIP saved you." All right? And there was always, of course, a crucial mathematical or arithmetical problem facing the Democrats. If your vote's going down by 16 percentage points, which is what it was, and there are constituencies where you didn't even get 16 percentage points last time around, you know what? Your vote's not going to go down by 16 percentage points in those constituencies. And therefore, inevitably, there are other places where you are stronger, where you're going to do worse. And occasionally, I remember at a conference, Steve Fisher, who I work with, took some survey data and said, well, look, you know what, actually, Liberal Democrats are really tanking in the places where they're strong. And Paul Tyler, former Liberal Democrat MP, now peer, said, "Oh, no, it's right, it's complete rubbish, you know." Well, there we go. This is actually what happened. This is how the Liberal Democrat vote fell. These are the constituencies where they had less than 16% of the vote last time. Their vote goes down by 11 percentage points. And basically, the stronger the Liberal Democrat vote last time, the more the vote fell. Almost inevitable. Now, they did do better in the constituencies that their incumbent MPs were defending. I mean, a few of them read the runes and kind of took the money and ran. But about 45 of them tried to defend their seats. And they did do better. I mean, in the constituencies where a non-incumbent was standing, forget it. So up in Berwick, I mean, there wasn't a hope in hell of the Democrats hanging on to Alan Beath's seat once he decided to stand down. But all basically the incumbency effect did was to bring the decline in the Liberal Democrat vote in constituencies they're trying to defend more or less in line with what was going on elsewhere, i.e. they lost 15 percentage points on average. Ergo, therefore, they were going to lose a barrel. And therefore, as a result, their votes, what they had managed to achieve in the 90s, which was to get their vote more geographically concentrated and therefore begin to beat the system, all that's been lost. Along with, by the way, the whole of the Liberal Democrat local government base that was created since the 1970s, and the party is now back to where it was in 1970, which is a long, long way back. Okay. However, their salvation is that although their vote is indeed, this is just simply a measure of how evenly spread or unevenly spread a party's vote is. Conservative Labour votes vary a lot from one part of the country to another. Their salvation was that although their vote is still more evenly spread than it was, it's not as evenly spread as the UKIP vote, therefore they get rather more in the way of seats than UKIP did. And the SNP's vote is very evenly spread, but if you get 50% of the vote, an even spread's fantastic. That means you get 50% everywhere, which means you win everywhere. We always knew that it would be possible for the SNP to go completely walkies across Scotland if indeed they were ever to march by the head of Labour. Usually their even spread's a disadvantage, but in this occasion it proves to be a big advantage. So again, remember, first past the post, it doesn't matter how many votes you get, it depends on their geographical distribution. And the geographical distribution had an important impact this time. So, if indeed first past the post cannot necessarily be guaranteed to deliver what we might expect it to do, what might have happened if we'd had PR? Now, there's a few assumptions we have to make here, like people voting the same way, which is not necessarily valid. This is a regional PR system. We've not assumed that there's any minimum threshold. If there's a minimum threshold, we reduce the number of Greens. We've not equalised the number of seats per region, which arguably should be done. But just to give you a tantalising picture of where we might be at, on this calculation, Tories 236, with UKIP at 81, and if you knock in about 8 or 9 unionists, you get to about 325. Yeah. In other words, with PR, it's very, very difficult to tell whether or not under PR Cameron or Miliband would have been Prime Minister, because the truth is the two blocks would be so close. It would depend exactly on the PR system you had, on exactly how many seats there were per region, etc., etc. But of course, what is true, and I think one of the reasons why one suspects that the Democrats will not be arguing vociferously for PR in the immediate future, is that the principal beneficiary will be Nigel Farage. Which of course is obvious. But notice, of course, also, the SNP, who are in favour of proportional representation, not quite sure they'll be shouting too loudly for it in the immediate future, because they've only had 30 seats in Scotland rather than the 56 they got. But anyway, so in other words, for those of you who are kind of thinking, well, maybe if we had PR, we would have had a left-leaning government. Not necessarily so. It's frankly too close to call. Okay, let me then move on to events north of the border. Why did we end up where we are, and why, in a sense, the Blairite analysis of why Labour lost is frankly wholly inadequate? Let me explain. Labour's basic problem is that in the referendum last September, about 40% of those people who voted for it in 2010 voted yes. And for most people in Scotland, the May general election was a rerun of the referendum. The referendum made the constitutional question in Scotland the central issue of Scottish electoral politics in a way that it never previously been. There were always people in the past who were kind of vaguely pro-independence minded but would vote for Labour, at least for Westminster elections. But having put an X on a ballot paper saying, I want to get out, they were going to stick with it. And literally, I mean, it's almost all. It's nearly 90%, according to all the survey evidence, of those people who voted yes last September voted for the SNP. And there was then about 15 or 16% of the no voters, the people who aren't in favour of independence but are willing to vote for the SNP because they're cheerleaders for Scotland. Whiz, bango, you get up to 50%. Virtually nobody who voted yes is voting Labour. And of course the other problem the Labour Party has is that the Unionist vote was divided. So it's not that if 90% of people who voted no voted Labour, well, at least it would have been a fairly even contest. But only around 42% of no voters were voting Labour, lots of them voting for the Tories, a few of them were left for voting for the Liberal Democrats. So fundamental problem for Labour is that this group of people got dislodged. But it isn't just about the constitutional question. It's also about something else. It's also about Labour not being seen as the party of equality by voters on the left in Scotland, and the SNP having captured that territory. I'll give you some idea here. This is some data from last autumn, just after the referendum, and I'm comparing. These are the voters who switched from Labour in 2010 to saying they were at that stage they were going to vote for the SNP. And these are all voters in Scotland. So, surprise, surprise, the people who switched from Labour to the SNP, most of whom are yes voters, feel very strongly Scottish. Right? That probably doesn't come as news to you. And they feel even more intensely Scottish than do Scots in general. Surprise, surprise also, they're virtually unanimous in wanting the Scottish Parliament to have more powers. That isn't a surprise. Here's the crucial bit. They're also more likely to be in favour of the redistribution of income by government, from the less well off, from the better off to the less well off. These are folks on the left. And where do they think the parties are? Well, even amongst the Scots in general, people were slightly more likely to think the SNP backed redistribution than did the Labour Party. But amongst those who are switched, much more likely to regard the SNP as in favour of independence, as in favour of redistribution. And here again, it's the other legacy of the referendum. Stroke Labour's failure to come up with a vision for Scotland for the last 15 years, ever since devolution. In the referendum, the SNP had two principal instrumental arguments in favour of independence. One was, we create a more prosperous country, we'll have the levers of power, we'll be able to grow the economy. And the other was, we will create a more equal society. And whether or not people agree or disagree with it, the truth is that in the wake of that referendum, which was a really 2-year intense political debate, everybody in Scotland understands what the SNP claims to be in favour of. Anybody, if you sat them in a lecture theatre and said, write me on one side of A4 a paragraph as to what kind of country the SNP want to create, everybody could do it in 5 minutes. Set them the same task for the Labour Party, there'd be scratching of heads, well, maybe this, maybe that. The truth is, ever since the advent of devolution, the Labour Party in Scotland had never succeeded in coming up with a distinctive policy platform. And it then, of course, went into a referendum campaign that was primarily negative because they're just basically campaigning against independence. They were also, of course, doing it with the Tories that didn't help. Came out of it, and well, the vox pop goes like this. And you hear this time after time. Yeah, we used to vote Labour around here. They took us for granted, and we don't know what they stand for anymore. But it does therefore mean, right, and where did Labour above all lose in Scotland? Did they lose because people felt the Labour Party wasn't aspirational enough, had gone too far to the left? No. And so anybody who's trying to sort out the Labour Party now has to take on board that in Scotland at least, whatever the arguments about south of the border, the problem is the party is not sufficiently far to the left in the eyes of voters, or at least it doesn't have a vision that people buy into. Arguably that's a problem south of the border too. Now, that said, one crucial corrective. The SNP's success in the election tells us far more about the electoral system than it does about support for independence. These are the opinion polls that have been conducted since the referendum, which asked people how you would now vote. It comes from a website I run called whatscotlandthinks.org. And there's been the odd opinion poll that's put yes ahead, but the truth is I could tell you why methodologically they were dubious. This is pretty consistent now. There remains a small majority in Scotland in favour of staying in the Union. And if we make an allowance, in fact the opinion polls slightly overestimated the yes vote in the referendum, it's probably still around the 55-45 mark. Scotland's not changed its mind. There's certainly no evidence of support for independence going down, but on the other hand, it's also pretty clear that there still isn't a majority of independents. So, you know, if you're some of you are wondering, well, why are the SNP not willing to tell us whether or not they want another referendum or not? Well, a crucial reason is they're not sure they're going to win. All right? Now, I mean, there was nobody more shocked in May 2011 than the SNP themselves when they won an overall majority and suddenly came to and then Cameron said, yeah, you can have a referendum. There was a realisation, oh my God, we've got to deliver. That wasn't the idea. All right? Because if you're wanting to run an independence referendum, you don't want to start with about 37-38% of the vote, which is what they were doing. I think they did brilliantly to get to 45, and they've held it since. So why are they prevaricating? They're prevaricating because the truth is they know they can't afford to lose a second referendum, and they also know that winning a referendum on independence is tough. So until you've got about 60% support and you've got it consistently over a period of time, it's probably a lost cause. But of course, given that virtually everybody who's voting for you is in favour of independence, you can't be like the Duke of York and say, no, we want to all go back down to the foothills. Instead, of course, what we do is we say what we want is even yet more devolution. And let me just say a little bit about that, because opinion in Scotland on more devolution is a little more complicated than even people in Scotland realise, let alone anybody south of the border. Now, this is the evidence, and Scholars Societies has collected this on a number of occasions. If you ask people in Scotland who should run something, if it's domestic, the answer always comes back from a majority of people on virtually any issue, the Scottish Parliament. And you can see this, schools and health, which are already devolved, 2/3, but equally welfare, benefits, taxation, both of which are now going to be devolved to a degree, especially taxation, but aren't very much as yet. You almost get as many people in favour. Ask people about defence and foreign affairs, and they go, no, no, Westminster can work out the foreign shit, we'll just look after Rome, Mark, thank you very much. Right? But that's the very clear instinctive reaction. Legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of the Scottish public, so far as domestic affairs are concerned, appears to lie in Edinburgh, not at Westminster. But, as the Better Together campaign themselves put it, well, sorry, here's more evidence that says the same thing. Not sure about state pension, not sure about broadcasting, but virtually everything else domestic. People say yes. But as the No campaign put it, what the Union potentially offers is the best of both worlds. And that's exactly what Scotland wants. Because, yeah, Scotland wants to decide for itself. Taxation, welfare, anything domestic, pretty much. But, do we want a different rate of income tax? Which, of course, is already potentially in track in less than 12 months' time now, because the 2012 Scotland Act guarantees it. Oh, no, we're not quite sure about that. No. And then, of course, well, now, who would you like to fund unemployment benefit or your pensions? The UK taxpayer, please. Best of both worlds. Yeah, we make the decisions, you cough up. Yes, see, it sounds perfectly reasonable to me. And the truth is, therefore, that actually Scotland needs a serious debate about more devolution. And I've long argued, again, nobody still seems to be thinking about it. I mean, why the unionists aren't thinking, so, well, hang on, you know, we've got this enormous row about more devolution. Apparently, we've got this enormous SNP support. We've got them still wanting about a referendum. When is the point at which unionists themselves will say, what we need to do is to actually run a referendum on more devolution and actually have the intellectual debate about how far Scotland wants to go. But so far, still nobody seems to suggest this idea. But I think the truth is, you know, Scotland now has a pretty good idea. We've had a really good, serious debate about independence. Everybody knows what questions to ask about it. But the questions to ask about more devolution, we're still not quite sure. And working out exactly where the boundaries should lie is perhaps something upon which much more public discourse is required. But anyway, and of course the other great advantage it would be is you would force the SNP to argue in pretty much. I mean, the SNP would either be faced with a choice of saying vote no to more devolution, which would be a very tough place to be, or you force them to vote to campaign for a package that's probably less than they want. All right. Anyway, as yet, still nobody thinking of that one. Okay. What does England want? Still not very keen on devolution for itself. You guys up here scuppered that one 10 years ago. English votes on English laws. Yeah, that's widespread agreement south of the border about that. It's become a little bit more intense, but it's always been there. Unfortunately, however, we never ever asked the question before the advent of devolution. And I've got a nasty suspicion that people in England don't think that Scottish MPs should ever have been voting on English laws even before the advent of devolution, but we'll never know. But it's become a little more intense. You can see here the proportion of people who strongly agree with the proposition has tended to go up, but it's clear majority. By the way, majority of people in Scotland agree with people in England on this subject. They think there are far better things for their MPs to do than be voting on English laws, but anyway. Okay, finally then let me go to Europe and the implication of this for Scotland's, for Britain's place in Europe. Number one, why do people vote for UKIP? I'm going to come at this via UKIP. Why do people vote for UKIP? Immigration. This is from polling that Ashcroft did, asking people, which party do you think is best at whatever? These were the figures for UKIP. Nobody trusts UKIP to run schools or the economy or the NHS. They do. More people, however, said they trusted UKIP on immigration than any other political party. And of course it's the ability of UKIP to put together the issue of Europe, together with the issue of immigration, because of the freedom of movement provisions, that has enabled them to make Europe, which is still not even here actually for people necessarily, particularly a UKIP issue, has enabled to turn them into such a crucial issue. So point one therefore is, in terms of thinking about the implications of all this, this is very much a party that's appealing to a particular niche market of people who are uncomfortable about immigration. And again, this gives you some idea of where this market lies. So this is, again, looking at seats in England and Wales, going back to the general election, where are the places where UKIP's vote went up most as compared with 2010? Well, first of all, they are places where not too many people have been to university. All right. This is the proportion. This is dividing constituencies according to proportion of people. Proportion of people who had no educational qualifications at all. UKIP support goes up far more in places where there are people with relatively few educational qualifications. We know that universities are conspiracies in favour of liberalism. People who go to university end up being more liberal on social issues, including not least on issues of ethnic diversity, and you can see the effect of education here. Secondly, however, places with relatively low income, places, again, it's that part of Britain that probably hasn't felt the recovery, and we know from survey data that UKIP supporters were extremely economically pessimistic. UKIP does better, which is part of the reason why I'm still a little bit not convinced by the arguments that UKIP particularly damaged Labour, because actually UKIP did well in places where Labour did well. But anyway. And equally on unemployment, not quite so strong, but the places with the highest levels of unemployment, again, UKIP do better. So it's left behind socially conservative Britain, where UKIP does well. But of course, what is that? We can't necessarily assume that because a party gets 12-13% of the vote, that therefore Britain is wildly Eurosceptic. So let me just take you a little bit about the evidence on where we are on Europe. This is some British Social Attitudes, which has been asking questions about Europe on a fairly regular basis ever since 1983. This is the trend since the 1990s. This is the last 3 years. We have been more Eurosceptic. The Eurosceptic here is defined those people who either want to get out or agree with David Cameron that we should stay in, but we should have a looser relationship. They should be able to boss us around less. And there is no doubt we have been more Eurosceptic in recent years than ever before, certainly over this time period. Although it isn't clear that it's got any greater. And as it were, this is So actually the popularity of UKIP doesn't correlate simply with this figure, this is going down. Why, this is one of those events that gets forgotten. This of course is we're starting here in the period where the Tories were just beginning to kind of grumble about Europe and begin to divide themselves and beginning to move in a Eurosceptic direction. But the big jump is here. And this is arguably the origins of British Euroscepticism, at least the current level, is the banning of British brief in the wake of the BSE crisis in 1995. There's a big jump. You know, there's nothing worse you can do than a Frenchman saying you can't have British beef. All right? There's nothing more guaranteed to get us upset. And the truth is, we seem to have been upset ever since. All right? So my recommendation to Angela Merkel, François Hollande, if they wish to ensure that David Cameron wins the referendum, is to eat a plate of Yorkshire pudding and roast beef in front of the cameras, and it's fine, you won't need to give David Cameron very much. This is much more short term, but again just to underline how the rise of UKIP you can't simply read from that levels of Euroscepticism. This is data from YouGov, which simply asks people, would you vote to stay or would you vote to leave in a referendum? Now, in the early years of the coalition, going back to 2012, where we had very high levels of Euroscepticism on the other measure, people would say they'd vote to get out. Very clear majority to get out. Then, David Cameron gives his Bloomberg speech, the speech which means we now have the referendum, and proved to be useless as a speech of getting UKIP support down, but actually proved to be rather effective at persuading people that maybe we might want to stay inside Europe after all, because he was now offering the prospect of staying in Europe but beginning to reduce Brussels' powers. We then come to the European elections. And in the European elections, all our politicians were saying, oh, the European Union is reforming, we think it needs changing here, it needs changing there. The more our politicians criticize the European Union, the more we seem to be willing to vote for it. All right? It's a paradox here. And seemingly, therefore, if we get the sense that the people realise. And the truth is now, actually, coming into the election, we now have a majority saying they vote in favour. So certainly it's going to be tough for those who wanted to get us outside the European Union, because even now, before David Cameron comes back with this piece of paper waving, it's okay, it's fine, we already apparently are in favour. Why does his position work? I think this is now breaking down attitudes more carefully. The truth is that on Europe, the majority of the public are Cameronians. That is, the modal voter says, well, I suppose we should stay in the institution. We're not really that keen on it, but rumour has it it's good for us. So I suppose we'll stick with it, but if they could boss us around a bit less, that would be an awful lot better. And so therefore Cameron can come back with his piece of paper, much like Howard Wilson did in 1975, saying it's all fine, it's okay, I've renegotiated our terms of membership, Brussels won't boss us around as much. It's very difficult to see how the referendum could be lost. Now the crucial thing, of course, is whether he can get that piece of paper. Why do we feel that way? Well, number one is we don't feel European. This is not an institution. The idea of Europe being a union, of us being all part of a wider European, it doesn't work. Europe is still other for us. It's not part of us. There's been no growth of European sense of identity over time. But ask us, if we have stronger links with the European Union, do you think we're better off or not? Well, not many of us think the economy will be weaker as a result of closer links with the European Union. And an awful lot of us kind of think it will be stronger. So that's why we're instrumental Europeans. So, to conclude, Conservatives won. Simple explanation, the fate of Liberal Democrats. The more complicated explanation, because Labour failed to offer an effective alternative. The argument about the electoral system will not spring a great deal into life at the moment, but it's still there. First past the post is still going to struggle to produce overall majorities. Scotland is now politically a nation apart. British politics no longer exists. but quite where Scotland wants to be on more devolution is still not entirely clear. This is not a prediction, by the way. Britain probably will vote to remain inside the EU, so long as, the if conditions are always crucial, so long as Cameron can strike a deal. But all of this, of course, means we're going to have a debate about Europe, we're going to continue arguing about Scotland, the electoral system is going to be bubbling away. You know what, we're going to keep on arguing about how we are governed, and I bet after 2020 we'll still be arguing about how we are governed. But anyway, there we go.
It's just conceivable there could be some questions. We have 2 roving microphones, one already at the back, I see. If you could keep your hand up for a moment, one at the back, please. And when you get the microphone, please speak into it quite closely so we can all hear as close as you think you need to be. And one there, please, just the chap in the pink shirt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor. The other political parties...
Can you hold it a bit closer, please? Sorry.
The other political parties would have to make up their mind to support or to go against or not to give an opinion on the European referendum. Given that junior parties suffer substantially at the following election, which of the other political parties do you think will go along with him so that he does well?
So you're saying who's going to back a yes vote, a stay-in vote in the European Union European referendum?
Yes.
So long as Cameron gets a deal, at the official level at least, every political party in the UK apart from UKIP. I mean, there will be a split inside the Tory party, and that in itself will be fascinating. But the truth is that this will be an even more lopsided contest than the 1975 referendum, because hey, I mean, you know, the Labour Party is now virtually unanimously in favour of staying in Europe. The trade union movement's in favour of staying in Europe, which is much more circumspect about it in the 1970s and was opposed in the 1980s. The Liberal Democrats will be in favour, the Greens will be in favour. They'll be critical, but the Greens will be in favour. The SNP are in favour, Plaid are in favour, CBI are in favour. Even more one-sided than it was in 75.
Would you mind passing the microphone along? I think there was someone else there. Yes, thank you. Gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. Did people change their minds in or close to the ballot box? And if so, which people? Lazy Labour, shy Tories, or somebody else?
The honest answer is we don't know the answer to that question. Nobody has as yet done any, has published any survey evidence on switching from before polling day to afterwards. You can bet your bottom dollar that most of the polling companies will be doing it, but it's not yet in the public domain because all of them need to find out how far people switched, and that therefore is an explanation. But we don't know the answer. I mean, you know, that may be true, but you know, I will simply say to you that, well, I mean, Lord Ashcroft on the day did get a 3-point Tory lead, but you know, he still didn't get a 7-point one. YouGov, when they went back to people whom they had interviewed, that's the nearest thing we've got. They haven't published the data yet, but YouGov on the night said it was going to be about 34. They say nothing has shifted from what we said at 7 o'clock this morning. So such evidence as we have so far is not particularly sympathetic to the people moved at the last minute thesis, but the truth is we need a lot more evidence before we can be clear. And I mean, I'm the person who instigated the inquiry into the polls, and to that extent at least the inquiry now needs to be allowed to go ahead to find out the answers to these questions. So the honest answer is we don't know. It's equally possible the polls were always wrong, which was true in '92.
One more back there.
What do you think the prospects are, at least in the medium term, for any change in the voting system?
I think the lesson the Liberal Democrats have learnt, well, lesson number one is don't fight a referendum in favour of changing the electoral system when you are yourselves jolly unpopular. Two, make sure that the alternative system that you're voting for is one you actually believe in. I mean, AV was the choice between AV and FPP was the narrowest possible choice, and one of the fundamental problems was that the people who were arguing in favour of AV didn't really believe in it. They wanted PR. All right. I think they probably now realise that it will only happen if you can persuade one of the larger parties to be willing to be also campaign in
And what do you
favour
think
of
the
it.
prospects of that are?
Well, I guess one of the implications of what I've said today is that it may be that the Labour Party, which was beginning to edge in this direction in the late 80s and early 90s, as it began to lose its confidence in its ability to win under first past the post, it may be that that confidence will have been undermined as a result of this, and the Labour Party might begin to inch in that direction. But of course there are still, and of course the way in which it's seen how first past the post and completely destroy it in Scotland will have added a certain weight to that argument. But I would not expect the Labour Party to move very fast very soon, because there'll be plenty of people inside that party who are not that keen. But you know, if the Labour Party lose again in 2020, then that we might begin to see Labour moving.
Gentleman in the white shirt there, please. And anyone over this side of the room, just there. Yeah, great. Oh, could you start first, please? Yeah, thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
I live in Berwick-upon-Tweed, and on Friday morning I was very frightened, and you've actually done a lot to reassure me tonight that we don't have to face the situation when England leaves the EU and Scotland stays in, and Berwick becomes the frontier of the EU and the Schengen zone. But the question I wanted to ask you is, in Berwick we have had serious discussions. Is David Cameron just extremely stupid, or is he deliberately trying to get rid of Scotland? Because everything he does seems to be designed to provoke the Scots into voting for independence. And is that a deliberate policy, because he knows if he gets rid of Scotland he'll have a permanent majority in England?
No. He's an instinctive unionist. He wants to keep... Well, A, he's an instinctive unionist. He wishes Scotland to remain. B, he knows perfectly darn well that there are major strategic reasons as to why England wants Scotland to remain inside the Union, and why any UK government should want Scotland to remain inside the Union. However, he is also perfectly well aware that as a way of winning votes, A, raising the spectre of the SNP, of the Scottish tail, the SNP tail wagging the English dog, is kind of pretty good electoral politics, perhaps. And there was a potential constituency for that argument, particularly amongst UKIP supporters. Of course, introducing English votes on English laws. Well, of course, originally the idea was to embarrass the Labour Party. Well, the Labour Party's not really embarrassed anymore about English votes on English laws. But you know, it does meet a kind of it gives the Tories some sense of, you know, actually responding to how England feels about certain aspects. You know, hang on, if the Scots are getting all this, why isn't England getting something? No. So I mean, I understand why he is where he is. But no, I mean, you know, you have to realise that, as well as kind of saying, well, England should also get some kind of recognition. I mean, the current government is committed to implementing at least the proposals of the Smith Commission, and in truth has not ruled out the possibility of going even further than that. And you know, the proposal of the Smith Commission would make Scotland one of the most devolved parts of a sub-territory anywhere in the world. So it's a non-trivial offer. And you know, the Tory party has completely changed the position. I mean, the Tory position essentially, I think, on Scotland now is, you know what, it is lost territory for us, so we'll let them govern themselves domestically, but we do need strategically to hang on to them as part of the UK. And I think that, you know, within Scotland, the Conservative Party has now come around to the view of saying, well, look, if we're going to have this Parliament, then it needs to be financially accountable. So therefore, devolving taxation is something that Tories are becoming increasingly comfortable with. So you may end up paying different income tax if you live in Berwick than if you live across the border.
Chap in the white shirt there.
I know the publicity given to the false polls months before the election, did that have an impact on the actual vote that was made?
Well, it comes back to, I think, to the earlier question as to whether or not there is any reason to believe that the spectre of the SNP potentially putting Labour into power did or did not shift people at the last minute. There isn't any evidence in the opinion polls that it shifted them, at least not in terms of in aggregate terms, but of course we're still wondering why the opinion polls were wrong. So I think that still remains an open question.
The question here, please.
I've read a couple of articles since the election saying that the private polling that the parties were doing produced results that were more accurate than what we saw in the press.
Yeah.
Is that the way we have to go to get better polling, methodology?
The argument comes from an executive working for Greenberg, which is we're doing Labour's private polling, and the argument was that we asked people a variety of questions in advance of asking the voting intention question, and in our view, as a result, therefore, we got a more accurate portrayal because you'd warm people up. I am hoping that Greenberg will now make their data available to the British Polling Council inquiry. Having opened their mouths, it seems to me that they are now duty-bound to do so. That will enable us to evaluate the claim. The other thing I've been able to do in the meantime, the Academic British Election Study, which is done by, the part of which is done by YouGov, did actually ask one question, and it was only one question, but it did ask people one question before the voting intention question, which was, what's the most important issue to you? So they had warmed people up a bit. It shows the same numbers as the opinion polls. But that's not sufficient evidence to say Greenberg aren't right. I mean, there's long been an argument about question order. I think everybody, the consensus in the industry many years ago was that you should ask it first. Maybe that consensus is wrong, but I think it's now duty-bound on Greenberg to provide us with the evidence.
I have a question here, please.
As part of the Boundaries Commission review, there has been some speculation, some talk of the number of seats in the House of Commons being reduced from 650 to 600. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to speculate, if that were to happen, what effect that might have on future elections?
It is possible to speculate, because I've done the speculation. If the Tories do nothing, right, the Tories do not have to do anything to get for the next boundary review to take place. What happened in the last Parliament is that Labour and the Democrats were able to pass an amendment to the law that introduced individual electoral registration, which you may have heard a little bit about, which said that the boundary commissioners were not allowed to report until October 2018, which effectively killed the review in advanced election. But that's all it did. So the rules for redistribution, which were changed, and the timing of the review for the next Parliament are utterly unchanged. But what is true is that redistribution is predicated on the Conservative promise of the 2010 Parliament to reduce Parliament from 650 to 600. And so if nothing changes, that is what will happen. But you know what? I've got a suspicion that the Tories may now think that reducing the size of the House of Commons is not such a good idea after all, because of course one of the things that the Tories discovered in doing that, of course, if you do that, you really do end up with a radical redistribution of boundaries. And lots of Tory MPs discover, oh, hang on, where's my seat gone? Hang on, it's saying he's got half of it and she's got the other half of it, and I seem to be stuck. And so I would not be surprised if in the quiet of the night there's an amendment to something or other that stops that. We'll wait and see. Now, it makes a difference, and it makes quite a crucial difference. If you reduce the size of the House of Commons, then what you will do, I talked about that spread of 5 to 12 in terms of, you will reduce that spread. Because if you reduce the number of constituencies, you help to restore some of the ability of the first past the post system to make a winner's bonus, because you end up creating more places that are evenly divided between Tory and Labour and everything, because they're bigger, all right? So the difference is, ironically, actually, although the boundary review will make it more difficult for Labour to get rid of the Tories, it will make it more difficult for Labour to get as many seats as the Tories. But actually, at the other end of the spectrum, on the calculations I've done, and they're quite difficult to do, it's not obviously the case that the boundary review will make it more difficult for Labour to actually win. Because once Labour are ahead, the ability with reduced number of constituencies to create a more winner's bonus means that actually Labour may not find it quite so difficult. So it has an effect on both parties.
At the back, please.
We're naturally very focused on Scotland at the moment, but in the event of a decision to leave the EU, do you think opinions in Wales and Northern Ireland may have a role to play?
You mean, do I think that Wales is going to want to be independent?
Well, what would the reaction be, and what would be the result of that?
Okay. It is in Northern Ireland it's on the island of Ireland that the prospect of the United Kingdom withdrawing from the European Union raises the most difficulty. Because as a result of that, the Republic of Ireland will be forced into Schengen, and there will be a Schengen border between the Republic and the North. They will have to have a border which is fully and absolutely patrolled, as compared with the one that, actually there's a fair degree of freedom of movement across the island of Ireland. And that is arguably the most difficult issue that will be raised by the United Kingdom leaving. So for Northern Ireland, even Unionists in Northern Ireland would not want it to be more difficult to get from Belfast to Dublin. So there's a real issue there for Northern Ireland, and I think Northern Ireland would be deeply upset and would be faced with the arguments in favour of joining the Republic of Ireland would clearly be promoted as a result of the United Kingdom getting out of the EU, because hey guys, which is better, to be at least in the same union as the rest of the island of Ireland, as opposed to a union which is now outside of Europe. So there are really fundamental questions there. Wales might be upset. Scotland is more Europhile than England, but not that much more Europhile. The modal voter in Scotland is also a Cameronian. So if it were to be a really narrow result, it is possible for Scotland to envisage a situation where Scotland would vote yes and England would vote no. But once it moves out to anything like a reasonably comfortable no vote, the odds are that Scotland would vote no as well. And of course, certainly I think if indeed the UK were to vote to leave the European Union, then I think there would be another referendum in Scotland, and it would be fought under completely different circumstances, and I think the economic arguments would be much more even-handed. So yeah, Britain getting out of the European Union could be a pretty good way of ensuring that England and Wales is left on its own.
Right over to the left now, please.
How well do we understand at this point which parties the 2010 Liberal Democrat voters switched to, and do we understand how much of that was protest or tactical versus a harder switch of the kind that the SNP saw?
Well, if you believe the opinion polls, which obviously is a crucial if at the moment, all the evidence of the opinion polls is that the principal beneficiary of the collapse of the Democrat vote was the Labour Party. Something like a third of 2010 Liberal Democrat voters switched to Labour. You see that in virtually every opinion poll over the last 5 years. Much of the Green advance was at Liberal Democrats' expense, and certainly the Green advance in the last 12 months when the Liberal Democrat vote went down further. Lots of people assumed the Greens take votes off Labour. They didn't. All the survey evidence is Greens were taking votes off Liberal Democrats. Hey, they both wear sandals, so you know. There's some transfer to the Tories, but not an automatic amount. But the Liberal Democrats were. It's tuition fees what did it. Right? It's perfectly clear. It's tuition fees what did it. And it's a big irony. It's not that actually people are opposed to tuition fees. Public opinion has swung in favour of tuition fees. Even in Scotland, public opinion is in favour of tuition fees. But if you say one thing on your unique selling proposition and do another, people just say, we don't trust you, we don't listen to you. And we can argue about the detail of what they've done, and there was a lot of merit in some of the detail of what they've done, and what happens in Scotland is smoke and mirrors, all right? But politically, absolutely disastrous. And they never quite realised the disaster they were walking into, and that's the problem they face. And they now really have, job number one for whoever is the new leader is to say, yeah, we really were sorry. And I think probably my first advice to the Liberal Democrats would be to come out in favour of reducing tuition fees and to say we got it wrong, that's what we should do, and that's just to get yourself into the starting point.
I now have enough questions. John's on 5 Live at 10:20, and I think we could be in here at 10:20 if we have any questions that have been asked. So those of you who've already got my attention, just remind me shortly afterwards. A lady in the third row here, I think perhaps your question's been asked already.
So sorry.
Just speak into the microphone, that's it. Yeah.
To thank you for your lecture. I think you've probably already answered it. Were you surprised at the fall of the Lib Dem vote?
No.
My husband was a Member of Parliament who fought Lib Dems from 74 onwards.
Yes.
Labour was out of sight. We always fought Lib Dems. They were so strong in the West Country.
Yes.
And their fall was massive.
Yes.
And I was quite surprised, but I think you've probably answered the question. Sorry.
No, that's right. I mean, the thing that made it worse, I mean, if the Conservatives had been at 34 rather than 38, they wouldn't have suffered so badly. So the expectation the Democrats might get 20, maybe even 25 seats was essentially predicated on the assumption the Tories would be around 34, 35, 33, 34. Well, once the Tories are at 38, that 16-point decline in the Liberal Democrat vote really messes you up, because at that point, given the Liberal Democrats are defending more seats against the Conservatives than they are against that. We knew the seats were defending against Labour were lost causes, all right? Because particularly in those places like Burnley, Redcar, etc., it was very clear that voters were really deeply unhappy about the Liberal Democrat position. But in the more Tory areas, not so obviously true. But once the Tories were at that level, then basically, it was very, very difficult. And did I necessarily expect 8? No, but I thought they were on a hiding to nothing. Absolutely.
Lady in the middle, please.
Yes. How does it feel emotionally and psychologically to be marooned in a gantry with Andrew Neil and everybody else telling you you're wrong?
I'm pleased to say that Andrew Neil was on one gantry and I was on another gantry. On the opposite side of the studio, so I was a safe distance. Unfortunately, it therefore meant I couldn't fire any paper airplanes at Paddy Ashdown, but there we go.
He had enough to eat by that point in the evening. Front row, please.
Hi, in case you don't know, I'm Chion Wara. I am the recently re-elected Labour MP for Newcastle Central. Thank you very much. And it's a fascinating lecture, and there are many points I could make, many points I could respond to, many questions I could ask, but I'm not going to, especially on an evening where Mary Cray has just announced that she's also standing for the leadership of my party. And so instead, rather than on the politics, what I'm going to do is ask you a question on the data. And I was, in fact, I think I still am actually, Shadow Minister for Digital Government, and my my background's in electrical engineering. And what proportion of the polling data that's been taken over all these years, which has proved to be apparently wrong, what proportion of that is available as open data so that we can all look at it? And is there a movement to have transparency in the polling data, the methodology? I've had a difficult time finding out what the actual methodology is, but the data and how it is dispersed or distributed.
Okay, I will quite happy to tell you more later on, but as President of the British Polling Council, I am president of the organisation that enforces rules of transparency on all polling organisations who are members. Any opinion poll that is published, the full computed tables, together with the full question wording, it has to be published according to rules by 3 days. In practice, during the election campaign, the moment a poll was published, or at least within a matter of hours thereafter, those tables and those details were fully available. Every company has on its website a statement of the methodology that it uses, and it has to signal every time it changes the methodology. So the answer is the Council already has very stringent demands in terms of transparency, so that anybody and everybody can evaluate what's been done and can decide for themselves whether they think whether it's useful or not. One of the things, it's just slightly premature, but I'm anticipating that one of the things that the inquiry will look at is whether or not those transparency requirements need to be enhanced or developed in any way. But basically, everything that a pollster does these days, it's available. And if you've got more questions, a pollster is obliged to answer those questions.
In the very far corner, gentleman over there, please.
Yes, hi. Could you just say a few words about the effect or lack of the effect of the Murdoch press on people's voting intentions, please?
Well, I have to tell you, I did a lot of research on this subject in the 1990s when it was supposedly the Sun what won it. and I haven't done much more recently, but I emerged from that research pretty sceptical about the idea that the press have much influence. Point one, newspapers are a declining industry. Less than half of the British public now regularly read any kind of newspaper. So there's a limit there. Point two is that one thing to be discovered by tracking people's newspaper readership over time is that if people don't like what they read, they're pretty rapidly willing to go off and read something else. Three, bear in mind what the Sun did, not for the first time, which was to say vote Tory in England and Wales and to vote SNP in Scotland. Remember also what the Sun did in 1997 and 2001. It said vote Labour, as indeed a lot of other newspapers. In other words, it's actually often easier to demonstrate that newspapers follow their readers, who after all are becoming increasingly scarce, than it is to demonstrate that readers are influenced by their newspapers. Now, that said, the research I did at that stage certainly was able to show that, if you kept on reading the Daily Mail, then there was a greater probability that you would switch in a pro-Tory direction over a period of time. Conversely, however, if you were reading the Daily Mirror, you were quite likely to be switched in the other direction. And when you put the two individual level effects together and tried to work out what was the aggregate level of impact, i.e., how much does it, it's just some people in the Tory direction, some people in the Labour direction, the net effect every time I did the calculation always ended up pretty close to zero. So I'm afraid I'm pretty sceptical about certainly the direct influence of the press. Now obviously what is true is that newspapers can provide a relatively easy conduit for political parties to get their messages publicised, and it's also true that sometimes the broadcasting media, their agenda gets influenced as a consequence. So there's a more subtle issue there about being able to command the agenda, but in terms of direct effects, I'm afraid I'm fairly sceptical about the influence of newspapers.
And the very back row over here, please.
Just going back a few points, I take your point about tuition fees.
Do you want us to speak in the microphone so everybody else can hear you?
Yes, is that better?
That's much better.
Yeah, okay. Just going back a few points, taking your point about tuition fees having helped to lose everything for Liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
I remain puzzled as to why a similar effect hasn't happened with no top-down reorganisation of the NHS and the Tories.
Simple answer, it wasn't the Tories' unique selling proposition. Right, it's the Liberal Democrats had made education, and particularly university education, one of their niche issues during the 90s and before 2010. They were even campaigning to say we will increase income tax by a penny in the pound in order to spend more on education. They had focused, look at the flipping constituencies that they represent. They had focused heavily on university towns and places with lots of students. They've been, in recent past, they've represented both Oxford and Cambridge, right, let alone anywhere else. So they had really made this one of their issues. And I would suggest to you it's the functional equivalent of, when George Bush Sr. Said in one of the presidential debates, read my lips, no new taxes. Absolutely equivalent. So it was something with which they were identified. Now, the Tories' good fortune is they're not identified with the NHS, all right? Despite David Cameron's best efforts. So in the end of the day, if the Tories start messing around with the NHS and messing it up, people are going to go, well, of course, that's what we expected. People did not expect the Liberal Democrats. I think they could. The real problem was that it wasn't. Given the financial circumstances, I think if they had said, oh dear, we can't get rid of tuition fees. Indeed, we're going to have to raise them to about £4,500. But this is something for the meantime, and we retain our aspiration for getting rid of them. They might just have got away with it. But the real problem was, in the end, it ended up being £9,000, and £9,000 was the full cost of an arts and social science education. So you actually moved to the position where apparently the full cost of tuition was to be borne by the student, i.e. you ended up at the complete opposite of your position, and therefore also raised questions about, well, therefore, is there ever any way back? So I think both because of the importance of the issue, because it was central to their appeal, it was something that it was an issue with which they're identified, and actually the way in which it turned out, they just got completely the worst of all worlds. And people just stopped believing them. Right? Why should we believe you? Right? You said this, you promised us this, you all signed it. This was what you really told us were your central things, and you do the complete and absolute and utter opposite.
Have I forgotten someone over here who got my attention and I've moved on? And over this, anyone I've forgotten to whom I nodded and now moved on? In that case, our last question is in the front row here, please.
Thank you very much for a most interesting talk. I know we all enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm fascinated by the outcome of your research as to how all the pollsters got it wrong. And I think many of us watching the media really enjoy a lot of people who are expecting to do well and they don't. And I remember some years ago there was a good paper by Professor David Denyer entitled Margaret Thatcher's Working Class Tories. I think it was the first time she came into power. And I think the Labour Party did a lot of research as to why their percentage of the vote dropped in Labour strongholds. They didn't necessarily lose the seats. And I think, you will know better than I think, to paraphrase it, was that a lot of people told the pollsters beforehand they would be voting Labour, but they changed, and I just wonder whether you think this has had an influence this time.
Don't know.
That was the answer. Excellent. I had some questions as well, but I didn't need to use them, fortunately, because we had so many stimulating questions from the audience. Before I thank our speaker, could I point out that we have an election bookstall outside the auditorium, including, I just noticed, a book by a Labour MP by the name of Chuka Umunna, of whom more may be heard in the future. Who knows? In thanking our speaker, could I perhaps offer a rejoinder? I think it's not really a case of him merely reporting data. I think the reason it's been such an enthralling talk, and so many of you are still here, is it's about explaining it, making it understandable in a persuasive and humorous fashion, and I hope to be has done that this evening. John Curtis.